5 o'clock, the last hour of today here on eNCA. Let's take you back to Boksburg now, where earlier on we heard from President Cyril Ramaphosa. We now have the Chief Justice Raymond Zondo also addressing the National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council. It's a dialogue looking at ways of building a corrupt-free South Africa. He's now talking.
For the Gupta-Zuma state capture starts. I don't think it started in 2010. I don't think it started in 2009. There is a good chance it started before the Polokwane conference. If you read some of the books on state capture in South Africa, you will know that the Guptas were in Polokwane, were at the conference or in the vicinity. But when you look at the evidence that was given in the commission, the incidents that we talk about are in 2010. Whatever else may have happened behind the scenes before that. You'll recall that Mr. Themba Maseko talks about his encounter with one of the Gupta brothers in October 2010, or thereabouts. You will also recall that end of October 2010 is when there was a dismissal of a number of ministers, including Ms. Barbara Hogan, who was Minister of Public Enterprises, who was then replaced by Minister Kigaba, who was friends with the Guptas. That's all in the evidence. And within a few days after Minister Kigaba became Minister of Public Enterprises, you will recall that he had a meeting with somebody that he was recruiting to be the chairperson of the Transnet board, Mr. Mkhwanazi. And you might recall that one of the statements he made in that meeting with Mr. Mkhwanazi was that one of the executives of Transnet who had been dismissed had been dealt with unfairly, and something needed to be done. And we know that that executive had been found guilty of very serious acts of misconduct. But later on, with the involvement of Mr. Mkhwanazi and Mr. Kigaba's advisors, that man was brought back to Transnet, despite a very thick disciplinary hearing judgment by a senior counsel, which indicated the serious acts of misconduct that had happened. But not only that, but this executive got paid his legal costs and got paid back pay for something that just didn't make sense. And then, of course, Themba Maseko at GCIS, as the professor indicated. And then from there, they went back to Transnet. You will recall it being in a newspaper of the Guptas who the next CEO of Transnet was going to be. And indeed, he became the CEO. And we know what happened after that at Transnet. And when they thought they'd done enough damage there, they announced who the next CEO of Eskom would be. And so it was. He became the CEO of Eskom. As if that was not enough, they then moved to Denel, And when you look at the modus operandi, you can see the similar features, how people were pushed out who would not play according to their rules, and others would be put in who would play along. I mention this because it links with what I said earlier on, that one of the issues that we kept constantly in our minds as the Commission was continuing with the hearing of evidence was there state capture? Who were involved? How did it come about? What measures would need to be put in place to make sure it doesn't happen again? So we needed to know how it had happened. When you look at the period that it took, it's about 5 years. From around, or 6 years, 2010 to 2016, 2017. And when you remember the amounts that the Commission has revealed were stolen, you're bound to ask yourself the question, how did this happen? These people were moving from one SOE to another, doing the same thing. Why did we not stop them? Leave out others that we know had no interest in stopping them. But as a country, as a people, did we do enough ourselves to stop this? For 5 years, 6 years, it was happening. That's a question that is very important when we talk about active citizenry that has been referred to before. Because we need to look at what might need to be done in the future in order to make sure that we never find ourselves in this kind of situation again. And in this regard, I want to thank the President for sharing with all of us as much information as he has shared with regard to what has been done. I think it's very important. But I also want to thank him for his acknowledgement of the work of the Commission. But I also want to refer to what he said when he said the Commission got established because the people of South Africa demanded it. Not only that, when the Commission was going on, and indeed there were attacks on the Commission, it was the people of South Africa. It was the NGOs. It was the civic organizations. It was some political parties who kept us going, because at times it was not easy. There was a time when we were told there was no money for the Commission to continue. And lawyers who were part of the legal team of the Commission, the evidence leaders and the investigators said to me, DCJ, we will not stop. This job is too important for us to drop just because there is no money anymore. And indeed, I think for a period of no less than 3 months, many continued to work without any pay. But I want to thank the President, because even when we had been told by National Treasury that there was no money, when I spoke to him, he did everything he could to make sure that the Commission was given money. I think that it was very important that the President stood with the Commission during those times. Because at some stage, I thought, well, those who did not want the Commission had found a way to collapse it by simply saying there's no money, so it must stop. But we were able to continue. And we thank all those who supported the Commission during that time. I gave you just a brief outline of how the Gupta-Zuma state capture happened. I just want to touch on some of the recommendations that we have made, because we bore in mind that we have to come up with measures which would either prevent another state capture or at least minimize the prospects of it happening. Because it was not going to be terribly helpful to identify the causes, identify the perpetrators, if we would not come up with recommendations as to what would need to be done to make sure that it didn't happen again. Of course, many of you here are very familiar with the recommendations of the Commission. The President, in his speech, mentioned a number of them. I will mention just a few. One that he also mentioned, which I would like to mention, relates to whistleblowers. Whistleblowers, investigative journalists, played a very critical role in the work of the Commission. Whistleblowers helped to make sure that we know as much as we know about state capture today. Whistleblowers helped to stop state capture. Now, everybody talks about the protection of whistleblowers. But all of you will be aware that the Commission went beyond that. That is not just the protection. We also need to incentivize them to blow the whistle. I mentioned recently in a speech that I'm aware that some are critical of the recommendation we made that whistleblowers should get some percentage of the money that we recover if their disclosure has been material in us recovering that money. Some criticize that on the basis that people are going to make disclosures because they want money, not because it's the right thing to do. I wish that everybody would make such disclosures because it's the right thing to do, not because they want money. But our levels of corruption are such that I do not think that we in South Africa can afford the luxury of saying We don't want information that is disclosed by whistleblowers who want money. We only want information that is disclosed by those who disclose information because they know it's the right thing to do. I want all the information. Whether you disclose it because you want money or because you disclose it because it's the right thing to do, disclose all that information. The critical thing is you are not going to be paid money unless your disclosure has played a material role in us recovering the money. So your disclosure must be quite important for the recovery of the money. So we pursue the recommendation that it's not just the protection against civil liabilities, criminal prosecution, and dismissals. All of those are important, but also the incentivization is important. The one part which we did not deal with, which maybe the Council will look at or maybe has already looked at, is that incentivization applies to somebody who discloses and who makes a disclosure and money is recovered. But there may be people who would disclose information and the theft of money is prevented from happening. We need to encourage that because that would be preferable. But maybe the Council can look at how do we incentivize people to disclose even before money is lost. They can look into that. I'm very glad that business has come on board in relation to trying to change the culture in the workplace, in companies, about corruption. Gibbs has published an anti-corruption working guide for companies in South Africa, which is very good, and if followed by many companies, will really play an important role in curbing corruption in the workplace. Another recommendation that we made in the context of us trying to answer the question, what measures should be put in place in order to make sure that state capture doesn't happen again, is the proposal about a permanent anti-corruption commission. The President spoke about it. Mr. Pretorius and Mr. Nombembe is aware that this proposal was being discussed in the Commission for quite some time before the end of the Commission. And for a long time, I didn't like it because I thought we have too many institutions that fight corruption in South Africa. But in the end, I decided that we should make this recommendation. The reason why we made it was this. The evidence had revealed that Parliament had failed to stop state capture, had failed to prevent it, and yet it had every opportunity, and it had failed over a long period of time. And it was quite clear that it was one institution that could have put a stop to it. So as we were approaching the end of the work of the Commission, the question was, what do we put in place for the Parliament to use its powers to stop state capture if it were to happen again? And that question became pronounced after the witnesses of the governing party, the president and Mr. Mantashe, had given evidence, and from the evidence it had become quite clear that the position of the governing party was not going to change, that it would give instructions to members of parliament as to how to vote, whether you're talking about public inquiries or a vote of no confidence. And of course, this is not something that one can say only the governing party can do. I have no doubt that there are other parties in the opposition who, given the same opportunity of being the governing party, would take the same stance and say, no, we are not going to allow you to vote to oust our own leader, or to say we're not going to allow public inquiries in regard to certain matters. So the idea was therefore that if, for example, a vote of no confidence is placed before the National Assembly in regard to a president in the future against whom there would be allegations of corruption, maybe in state capture, there should be a permanent commission which can see if Parliament is trying to sweep all of this under the carpet and be able to call whoever to come before the commission and answer all the questions that Parliament might not have wanted them to be asked, and unearth corruption and acts of state capture if there is evidence. And the idea was therefore that once all of that has been put out in the open, there may be a strong public opinion which would actually carry the day about whether that president, whoever it may be, should continue or not, and about whatever inquiries. That was the idea, to say if you leave it like that, the same thing would happen, even if it's a different governing party. So there needs to be another commission that would be a standing commission and assist us as South Africans in that regard. Of course, we also recommended that there should be a portfolio committee that would oversee the presidency, and I understand that Parliament is continuing to investigate that possibility. But you will have noticed that a lot of corruption connected with state capture happened in SOEs. So another issue for us in the Commission, therefore, was what was wrong in SOEs that made it possible for all of this to happen. Transnet, Eskom, Denel, SAA, Correctional Services, SARS. And one of the things that we identified was that the people who were appointed to boards of these SOEs, some of them lacked integrity. And often those who lacked integrity were in sufficient numbers to allow this to happen. And some of them didn't have expertise for the job that they were doing as board members. And that had not been by accident. That had been carefully planned. Because if I take you and put you in a certain position, and you know you are not qualified for it, you say, I'm doing you a favor. And you know that if you get out of that job, you'll never get a job like this because You are not qualified for it. You are going to do whatever I want. So people were put in positions where they were not qualified, they didn't have the expertise, they didn't have the experience, but above all, they didn't have the integrity, which was necessary for them to protect the SOEs. So we recommended that part of the problem was that boards were appointed by ministers and effectively the CEOs also. And we said, well, if we look at the history of what has happened, it seems that we mustn't have a situation where the minister is the one who chooses board members. Of course, CEOs must be appointed by the boards, not by the minister. But you need to have a panel or panels of people who are experts in the sector in which the SOE operates, who are independent, who will recommend who should be members of boards. And the minister mustn't be free to reject names. He must only or she must only reject names when there are good reasons. And in that case, not that he or she must then go and look for a board member himself or herself, must have sent everything back to the board, which must examine the reasons why he or she is rejecting those names. Unless we make a significant change in relation to SOEs and how they are governed, the boards, CEOs, CFOs, there is no way we are going to make a serious dent on corruption in SOEs. That is supposed to be an area of serious focus. And I have no doubt that this council appreciates that. So we had the Anti-Corruption and State Capture Commission to check if Parliament didn't do its job. In relation to this, we said for boards of SOEs, certain changes must happen, which the President essentially accepted. There may be one or two that he didn't accept. But we also said there should be a special dispensation in relation to public procurement. And we recommended the establishment of a public procurement anti-corruption agency. We see that the Public Procurement Bill of 2023 doesn't have an institution called like that. Initially, I thought that might be because the President has rejected that recommendation, but I understand now that it's not necessarily because this council is still considering all of those issues. The Public Procurement Bill of 2023 has got some interesting features with regard to the fighting of corruption. But I think a lot must still be discussed to try and make sure that what we have is going to be good enough for us to fight corruption as we move forward. Because most of the corruption that we get in South Africa is in the area of public procurement. If we can close the taps in public procurement, we will make a big difference in our fight against corruption. As I approach the end of my remarks, I want to endorse the view that ultimately we have to change the culture about corruption. All of these measures we put in place are good, but we have got to change the culture. It might take a long time, but we have to. And in terms of changing the culture, it's not a particular group or organization. It's each and every one of us in our daily interactions. It's how we raise our children. It's at schools. It's at churches. It's everywhere. The culture that should ensure that every one of us abhors corruption. Every one of us says we should have no corruption in our country. Professor Kachalia, I want to end by reading to you something that you might find and your counselors interesting as you look at what institutions and mechanisms you should recommend to the president should be put in place. But before I do that, I want to say the president referred to the fact that next year we will finish 30 years of democracy, and there will be a need for reflection on the journey that we have traveled. There will also be a need for us to look at the journey beyond 30 years. The past 30 years, some of them, the earlier ones, might have been good, but maybe half of them have been very bad in terms of corruption. And we don't want to have a repeat of that beyond our 30 years of democracy. I don't know about you, but one of the worst decisions that I think we allowed to be taken as a country in our fight against corruption was the disbandment of the Scorpions. The Scorpions were said to have a very high conviction rate. They were very effective, but we allowed them to be disbanded. Again, maybe we as citizens didn't stand up and fight enough. I have a sense that if the Scorpions had not been disbanded, we would not be having the levels of corruption that we have right now in our country. I have full confidence in the DPP that she and her team are doing the best they can under very difficult circumstances to fight corruption. But I'm aware that her term is not renewable. And one of the things we did was to stop Advocate Pikoli from continuing as NDPP. He's a man of integrity. He had shown that he was prepared to fight corruption irrespective of who was involved. Maybe sometime in the future, he might consider to assist South Africa in the fight against corruption. We must look back and identify some of the decisions that we have made as a country that have undermined our fight against corruption, so that beyond the first 30 years of our democracy, we will not repeat those mistakes. The Constitutional Court had to deal, after the disbandment of the Scorpions, with a constitutional challenge with regard to the Hawks. And the majority judgment dealt with some features of independence and had something to say about corruption. Features of independence for corruption-fighting agencies. And the majority judgment said, among other things, the Constitution is the primary source for the duty of the state to fight corruption. It does not, in express terms, command that a corruption-fighting unit should be established, nor does it prescribe operational and other attributes should one be established. There is, however, no doubt that its scheme, taken as a whole, imposes a pressing duty on the state to set up a concrete and effective mechanism to prevent and root out corruption and cognate corrupt practices. As we have seen, corruption has deleterious effects on the foundations of our constitutional democracy and on the full enjoyment of fundamental rights and freedoms. It disenables the state from respecting, protecting, promoting, and fulfilling them as required by Section 7(2) of the Constitution. Endemic corruption threatens the injunction that government must be accountable, responsive, and open, that public administration must not only be held to account, but must also be governed by high standards of ethics, efficiency, and must use public resources in an economic and effective manner. As it serves the public, it must seek to advance development and service to the public. In relation to public finance, the Constitution demands budgetary and expenditure processes underpinned by openness, accountability, and effective financial management of the economy. Similar requirements apply to public procurement when organs of state contract for goods and services. Close quotes. I believe that we must bear in mind those remarks from the Constitutional Court in the Glenisas 2 judgment as we continue our fight against corruption. I take this opportunity to wish this Council everything of the best in its work, which is very important for the country, and indicate that I will be available to interact with them and to make whatever contribution I can make. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Chief Justice.
And a standing ovation, it looks like, for the Chief Justice Raymond Zondo, one of the two main speakers at what is this anti-corruption dialogue taking place out in Boksburg earlier was the country's president, Cyril Ramaphosa. Very briefly, the Chief Justice focusing on their work during the State Capture Commission, talking about what stood out for him even after the report was handed out, is how those who were involved in state capture were so easily able to move between various state-owned entities, even mentioning, of course, the Guptas and the criticism that Parliament had failed over a long period of time to prevent and stop state capture. What does he suggest needs to be put into place? What powers does Parliament need in order to prevent this in future? Also, very briefly, as I wrap this up, whistleblowers and investigative journalists were noted highly by the Chief Justice for their investigative work, which allowed the Commission to continue what they were supposed to be doing. It's 20 minutes away from 6 o'clock. We'll get reaction to what both the President had to say and the Chief Justice here on Today on eNCA in just a moment.